All right.
Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Talk to Me Africa. Today, I am so excited to host Kim Korven all the way from Canada, and you are in Saskatchewan,
Correct.
one of the
Saskatchewan.
coldest places in Canada.
Yeah, it's the ambient air temperature right now. It's 11 a.m. It's minus 24, and it says it feels like minus 29. So there's a bit of a wind, and I'm staying in my house.
In your house, please. Wow. Well, thank you so much for accepting to be on Talk to Me Africa today. I'm going to introduce my guest to you and then we can start talking, okay, dear audience. So, Kim Korven is a former lawyer, I hope I do you justice, and a divorce mediator who figured out how to divorce peacefully without children suffering. Kim has helped hundreds of women experience peace through the divorce process. Now, as a divorce strategist and guide, Kim helps women who have wasted years in their marriages and have reached a breaking point, but are scared to expose their children to the trauma of a traditional divorce. Now, Kim, you guide women through a peaceful divorce, helping them navigate the legal system and communicating with their former spouses from a family-centered approach. And I should add that you were a lawyer for over 20 years and you had divorced peacefully. Welcome to
Yeah.
Talk to Me Africa.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a different journey,
Hmm.
certainly.
Yeah. Let's start with a quick fun fact about you. What's a quick fun fact you'd like us to know about you?
A quick fun fact about me.
Yes.
I pretend I can play the ukulele. Right? Basically, I just strum and and sing.
Anyway, that's a good fun fact. Yeah, we all pretend certain things. Anyway, let's talk about scamming and divorce and the law today, which is a field that you really handle well. And I reached out to you because you talk about scamming, and you say that if you've been scammed, reach out to me. There's a shame people don't talk about it. And let's start with scamming. If I say, "Hey, Kim, give me $5, I'll pay you tomorrow," I never pay you back. Is that scamming? What is scamming?
Well, that's not scamming because you're
Mm,
being very upfront,
mm,
right? And saying, "Oh, yeah, give me $5 and I'll pay you back tomorrow." You've at least said you're going to pay the person back,
mm-hmm,
okay? Scamming. So I was caught in an online phishing scam a couple of years ago, and they
mm-hmm.
actually took $9,500 of mine,
Wow.
or basically I gave it to them in the
Yeah.
end. Um, so scamming, I think the most dangerous, and I'll just share my story
Mm-hmm,
on
mm-hmm,
that. So I was working in a coffee shop, and this message popped up on my laptop screen.
mm-hmm.
This bright red border around it, music of doom. Your Microsoft account has, or your, I forget what software it was, has been compromised. You need to
Mm-hmm.
call this number immediately.
Yeah.
Right? So there was the music of doom. There was this border like flashing, and it's like, oh no, no, right? Like logic flies out the window when you
Mm-hmm.
get a message like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different than when you get an email saying, oh, this is compromised, or
Mm-hmm.
oh, you have this package
Yeah.
that we can't deliver because of, or even lately I've been getting messages, hey, we viewed your program, your profile, you'd be really good for an online for a job,
Mm-hmm.
and you can make X number of dollars,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Those ones I think are easy to spot and to
Right.
analyze and go, oh, get out of here. But I phoned the number, and I think it was Microsoft, and saying, oh, yeah, here's my Microsoft number. You can call this number to check, which I did.
Okay.
And they ended up saying, oh, well, we can just check your banking information. And there was this indication that my money had been used to purchase child porn, is what came up on my screen.
Yeah.
Well, of course, you look at child porn, you go to jail.
Mm-hmm.
And so it triggered an extreme emotional response,
Mm-hmm.
which shut off the logic circuits of my brain. And there was the whole thing about, well, it's somebody in your bank could be involved in it, so don't tell anybody. And I
Yeah.
had to contact my bank to increase
Mm-hmm.
how much money I could withdraw in a day.
Mm-hmm.
And they had me rehearse a story
Wow.
to tell my bank. And then, of course, it had to be Bitcoin. So it was really intense. And it was actually the second bank I went to, where I have money. And I was walking in and I remembered, oh yeah, I had met the fellow who's the manager there. I'd met him at a Chamber of Commerce function, and his
Mm-hmm.
name popped into my head. So I had asked if I could talk to him.
Yeah.
And because I'd met him before, and I mean, in the whole time I'm dealing with the banks, I'm on the phone to one of the scammers, and my phone's in my pocket so they can hear everything.
Mm-hmm.
That is part of it. But because I'd met him before and remembered his name, he asked me a couple questions and I told him the truth. And everything was shut down at that point. But the police were incredibly unhelpful. Like when I filed the police report, the officer was, well, we're never going to be able to find these people. Why are you doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm doing it. So you have a
Yeah.
record. Because
Mm-hmm.
this is, I said, this is me who, like, if people, I could see somebody who's less self-assured than me being completely crushed for years and years and years about it. And I mean, and even some people close to me were like, well, Kim, how could you be so stupid?
Yep.
Right? It isn't a matter of being stupid, it's a matter of when, right? Because the good scammers and right, so the shame, if you don't realize just how sophisticated the schemes are, could really, really do a number on people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my takeaway now when I get some kind of a weird message is, Kim, these companies,
Important. Yeah.
these companies, they're not in business. They do not monitor if there's been a breach in your security. That's not
Mm-hmm.
their job,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have McAfee or Norton,
Mm-hmm.
you're paying them
Yeah,
to
that's your
do
job
that.
to keep eye on security for you. Yeah.
But the actual apps that you use, that's not their job. They don't
No.
do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first kind of reality step. The other thing I think, and and I mean, because they do, what happens when strong emotions are engaged,
Mm-hmm.
you can't access the frontal cortex.
Yeah.
The emotions take over, so the
Mm-hmm.
logic circuits are gone. So of course you're gonna, like me, it was to clear this child porn thing. Yeah, I was gonna,
Do whatever to clear it because it doesn't have to be part of your record. Yeah.
right? And it can be negative. I mean, I talked to one woman who was caught in a catfishing scam,
Oh.
right? And she had been in a long-term marriage where she'd never felt seen
Yeah.
and met this fellow online, and they would sing together late at night and he'd write her poetry. And of course he wasn't here. There was and he needed money, but he was just the perfect, once again, getting a really strong emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
And And I think the final line in the sand for people needs to be if somebody asks you for Bitcoin,
Mm-hmm.
that needs to raise the flag.
Mm.
Just if that's what's planted in your subconscious, Bitcoin, no. Bitcoin request, no. Because what happens with Bitcoin is there's no tracing it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
the money's gone.
It's gone. Now you say it's not a matter of shame or stupid. You say it's not a matter of stupid, it's a matter of when. That means we are all susceptible to being scammed.
Yes, we are. And I suspect the scammers have PhDs working for
I
them.
probably they do.
I'm sure they do
PhDs in what they do best.
because that's what they need to do is to create
Mm.
an emotional, they create,
Mm-hmm.
take action that creates this really strong emotional
Mm-hmm.
response.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and all the most of the training around scam fraud protection is all based on the frontal cortex, very
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
logical. So when you are caught, it it really contributes to that shame. Oh, well,
Mm-hmm.
how could
Mm-hmm.
I knew
How
this?
could I have
How
done
could I
this
be
to myself?
how yeah.
How could I have fallen victim to this? Like, why didn't I think? Now, I have been scammed before when I was new in the country. I had my first apartment and I had Netflix. And out of the blue, somebody called me and said my Netflix account was due to be disconnected unless
Mhm.
I paid some fee. And I'm like, how much? It was $150. I go, no, I can't pay that. I wasn't thinking like you always like you said. So then they said, oh, in order to continue watching Netflix, you have to give us a card for $50. I took my legs to Target and bought this card. I forgot if
Yeah.
it was a Google card or something. And they said scratch and give me the numbers. I did. And so after a while, I think I was supposed to call back or something. It's been over 12 years. I can't remember. But I felt really stupid, but the thing is, I told so many people about it. So why is there a shame? Does the shame come in because of the amount you lose or because of the type of scam that you get into? Maybe like a catfish scam. You're a married
I
woman
think
and then you get into this. So it brings up the shame based on what kind of scam
well,
it is.
I think catfish scam, I think newly divorced woman more
Mm,
than married, right?
more than married, yeah.
Right. And I think the shame comes from we're encouraged, right? Like making a we're encouraged to be perfect. So making a
Yeah.
mistake is like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
that's bad. You know, we're lesser than
Mm-hmm.
if we make a mistake, when in reality, being human
Mm-hmm.
is making a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And $50 for you to learn with a 50, like that's actually really good.
I was really angry, but I talked about it a lot. So, but this is like a small amount. If somebody gets scammed and they lose their identity, from a legal perspective, how do you recover from that? How do you recover your identity?
Well, I never it was really interesting because the day I was scammed, they asked for my social insurance number, right? Which is my identity number.
Yeah.
And I have it memorized.
Did you give
But
it?
well, for whatever reason, the day I was talking to them, I couldn't remember all the numbers. Like I had a blank the last five numbers, I think.
Yeah.
Right? So something was protecting me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like see what was I had just started before I was caught in that phishing scam. I had just started using a vault for my passwords.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting when I was on the phone with them and we were, and they had given me what was in my bank, what was happening in my bank account, as we're scrolling that afterwards, I looked at my phone and somebody had tried to access all of my stuff, but with the password vault, because it didn't recognize the IP
Yeah.
address,
Yeah.
it blocked it.
Yeah. Wow.
So I think like using a vault for all your passwords makes a lot of sense, as well as the two-factor authentication.
Authentication, yeah.
And I think it's protecting our identity as much as possible, being proactive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, so there are some people on Facebook whose, you know, their age shows up as 102. Makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
Not using your real birth
Your
date.
real, that's right. Yeah, I don't have my real birthday on Facebook. People are like, oh, I have a November something, but I'm a February baby. I'm like, no, no, that's not my birthday. Sorry. People are happy, but I'm like, it's not my birthday. Yeah, I just have a different date, which I think is
Right.
fine. So what do I do if I get scammed or somebody takes money from me and I get ghosted? What action should I take?
Well, I mean, report it to the police because I think
Hmm.
they need to know. Even if they
Yeah,
can't do anything, they
yeah,
need to know
to
that this
have
is a
something in the
real
record. Yeah.
in the record.
Hmm.
Monitor your, like on TransUnion,
Hmm.
monitor your credit score.
Yeah, that's very important. Like you said, when you went to the police, they say, we're not going to find these guys, but you still had to report it because there has to be some, you know,
Well, and
documentation of
I
you
and I
making the
actually
payment.
reported the officer as well, who told me that.
Because his job is to take the information and start from there.
Well, it's not to discourage, not to like, because that could have a really create real harm for a person who's feeling a lot of shame. Like you don't
Hmm.
know where people are at.
Hmm. Hmm.
And don't you want to know what's going on in
Hmm.
society?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, let's leave scamming for a minute and talk about divorce, which I think there's some scam involved in divorce as well.
Well,
You have
there's certainly
the shame,
shame, feelings
the
of
shame
shame
involved in
involved.
divorce. I can tell you that from an African perspective, yes, there is a lot of shame involved in divorce from an African perspective because we are expected not to get divorced, and the shame comes to the woman, not the man, most of the time. I don't
Yeah.
know if that's the same where you were
Well,
raised,
it's
that when there's a divorce, the woman has to be the one who's ashamed that she went through a divorce, and the man is celebrated because the next day he can get married to another woman.
what's interesting is the British legal system. Divorce used to be an act of parliament,
Mm, okay.
right? A private member's bill. So there's still statute books. I can go to a law society library and look at acts of parliament about John Smith, um, his wife, Jane Smith, had sexual congress with Rob Cooper, and therefore, and it's in the act. So in 1857, the British Parliament introduced what's called, it was the Marriage Causes Act, and it was
Mhm.
all of these bad things you had to do as a precursor to getting divorced. And it was easier for a man to get divorced than a woman. And even the, physical cruelty to an extent to render the marriage. And I mean, and at this time, you have to remember that, the whole rule of thumb, a man could beat his wife
Mhm.
with a stick that was no big, that was, if it was smaller around than his thumb, it was acceptable. That was the rule of thumb. If it was bigger, then no, that was. So a woman had to come and say, hey, there's been such cruelty here that I can't continue to live with him.
Mhm.
A judge would then get to decide if she was being too sensitive or if the marriage could be ended.
Mm. She was being too sensitive.
Yeah,
And
right.
so was it your own divorce that led you to create what you called gentle way divorce?
So
And what is gentle way
it was
divorce?
so what happened was I never questioned the traditional divorce process. I was a zealous advocate for my clients before my divorce.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I worked on some really challenging files.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I realized, and I thought about ending my marriage for years, right? And the last 3 years of my first marriage, it was like, right? It was this, because it's not like a light switch. And people who haven't done it tend to think, oh, it's like a light switch. No, it's this roller coaster. You want to make it work,
Mm-hmm.
but there are these things that keep happening, that keep bubbling up, that it's like, oh, this isn't healthy. So it wasn't until I realized that staying together was actually harming my kids
Mm-hmm.
that I knew, okay, we have to stop living together. But that's when I realized how terrified I was of
Mm-hmm.
traditional divorce. Like, absolutely terrified. So it was like, I cannot do that to my kids. Like, I've always remembered there was one file at the office where I worked where whenever the parents exchanged their children, the police were called.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's and so and I'd worked on a child protection file once where my client had um, found a social worker to help her.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in court with a judge many, many, many times. So I interacted with the social worker a lot because she would always be there. And she would always say, children love their parents no matter what.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I remembered that. So when I asked my husband to move out, well, and I had remembered too that when he proposed to me, my whole body had screamed, say no. Like, but then I'm like, he's gonna cry. I don't know how to deal with this if he cries.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
it's an 8 hour drive home. Like, this is just gonna be so uncomfortable. I didn't think about 8 hours of being uncomfortable, or perhaps riding the bus home versus potentially a lifetime, right?
Yeah.
Like, if I'm uncomfortable now, what will that mean? But
Mm-hmm.
it meant I couldn't blame him.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a combination of things that led to this approach, right? Because I set a goal that I wanted my kids to have the best relationship possible with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew it would take about 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
It was just what my gut was telling me. So I wasn't expecting a light switch to go
Yeah.
on again. It was, no,
Mm-hmm.
this is going to take time. But the other thing about the gentle way, what underscores it, is my background is in judo.
Okay. Oh,
So
okay.
judo in English means the gentle way.
Mm-hmm.
And there are two principles to it. And one is maximum efficiency with minimum effort. And the second one is mutual welfare and benefit. And it was only on looking back, and I went, oh, that really underscored everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I basically, I was very respectful when I told my husband, it wasn't healthy for us to be together and it would be better for our kids if he moved out. And that's actually my script and the questions I'd ask myself. They're
Yeah.
available on my website.
Mm-hmm.
There's that. And it meant that I basically came up with, okay, here's what we do. It was a triage. It was not this, oh, I need to go to a lawyer. And
Yeah.
because as soon as you go to a lawyer, the other person becomes the enemy.
Right. Right.
And that increases the shame. And we'd mentioned the whole shame thing. Like in North America now, it's over, this is North America, Canada, and the United States,
Mm-hmm.
over 40% of marriages end in
In
divorce.
divorce. Yeah. The statistics are
So,
alarming.
so why do we feel shame about something that's so common?
Yeah. And if it's not working for you, you get out. Why do you have to feel the shame? If it's not, so you kept mentioning traditional divorce. What is traditional divorce, and is there a different type that exists?
Well, traditional divorce is your marriage ends, so you go to a lawyer, you start a legal action,
Mm-hmm.
and the language is all me against you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's all property terms.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other thing that happened when the British legal system moved from a private member's bill, an act of parliament, to a court, is divorce was put into the civil court system, which is two private individuals. And the system was designed for property disputes and
Mm-hmm.
contract disputes. So there isn't a lot there, in most, there should not be a lot of emotional attachment.
Mm-hmm.
And it was and like I working with clients in mediation recently. Um she, started the court process while we were in mediation.
Mm-hmm.
He was served with the divorce petition while he was at work,
Yeah.
which causes a feeling of humiliation,
Mm-hmm.
which increases the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he responded to her court document with a notice that he intended to defend, to contest,
Mm-hmm.
she phoned me up and she's like, I guess we're done with mediation. And I'm like, well, why? Well, he's contesting the divorce. And I'm like, no, 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 no. He's still participating in mediation.
Yeah.
It is all about, but the language on the forms turns you into enemies
Yeah. Yeah.
and increases the conflict, which increases the expense, which increases the harm to kids
Mm.
because it's the conflict that harms kids.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so traditional divorce, that's the approach. So if you can figure out, and the approach I take with people is let's figure out what you want your life to be like.
Mm-hmm.
Let's figure out what you want your children's lives to be like, your hopes and dreams for your kids.
Mm-hmm.
Because just as children love their parents, parents love their kids too and want the absolute best for them.
Yeah.
So if two people in conflict can get on the same page about their kids, and this is what happened in my situation, really incredible things can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, when I was going back and forth about to divorce or not, and I didn't believe in myself. I thought, how am I going to support myself financially? My kids' lives are going to be ruined, all of it. And I thought two women I knew who were single moms. Dad's like dad in one family not involved at all.
Mm.
In the other family, very limited involvement.
Yeah.
And they were raising really great kids. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, it can be done.
Can be
Okay.
done. Yeah.
So I had people, okay, it can be done. And that really helped to give me the courage um,
Mm-hmm.
to do it. And then I did a TEDx talk in 2024
Mm-hmm.
about divorce and children.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked my son if I could use his story, and he said yes. And in the course of doing the research for that, I learned in with kids with divorcing parents, half of the kids with academic and behavioral issues, the problems are first seen at least 4 years before the parents stop living together,
Mm.
right? Which says it's conflict. And conflict isn't just yelling and screaming and punching holes in the wall or punching each other. It's passive aggressive behavior.
Yes.
It's the silent conflict, the tension.
Yeah.
And I don't think I ever would have, I wouldn't have divorced for me. I would have been, well, I made this, you know, this commitment. I'm going to stick with it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was realizing the impact on my kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's what gave me the courage. So it's acting out of love
Hmm.
is why I ended my marriage, acting out of love for my kids.
Yeah, that's what my friend says. She's in Germany and she had been on my show to talk about similar story. And she said she divorced because of her children, because of the love she has for her children. And because her children are boys, she said, I don't want my boys to know that this is how you treat a woman, because she felt like she was not being treated really fairly. I remember when I
Mhm.
first came to America, I saw a divorce advert on TV, and the catchphrase was, the lawyer said that love your children more than you hate your spouse when you're going through a divorce. So put your children first. Love them
But,
more than you hate your spouse. Is that what do you
well,
advocate
but
for?
I'm saying the legal system is what makes you hate your spouse,
Oh, yeah.
right?
You're right. Because you're looking at what the law says you can or cannot do, you can or cannot have after the divorce.
Well, and the other thing with the civil law system is you never admit to doing anything wrong
All right.
because that could be used against you. So, but what
Mm,
you're doing is everything is phrased in a way that the other person, especially if it's over parenting time, you're
mm-hmm,
saying how awful a parent this other person is.
mm-hmm. That's why
Now
you
you're
want to
saying,
have a kid. Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how the game is played.
Mm,
Well, this is somebody you loved at one time.
mm-hmm.
And I work with women who, even in the most horrific relationships, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is somebody they created children with.
Right.
They're still loved. Like they'll say, well, I still love him. I don't want
Mm-hmm.
him to hurt anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So I think take the hate, like it's when we use the language of hating the other person, everybody loses
Yeah.
and everybody remains stuck in trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could have looked at all the ways, and my brain initially, when I was separating, went there, all the ways my former spouse was horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking, oh, I don't want him to see the kids at all. But
Mm-hmm.
then my knowledge of the legal system kicked in, and I said to myself, Kim, like you have never raised any of these concerns with anybody. So if you go to court and say them, the judge is just going to look at you and go, Ms. Corvin, you're just doing this. This is what the judge is going to think. Ms. Corvin, you are just saying this to get advantage in this parenting
Mm-hmm.
dispute. And I
Mm-hmm.
would lose credibility.
Yeah.
It was like, pull up your big girl panties, Kim, and just figure out how to make this work.
Mm-hmm. But why do parents use children as a bait during divorce proceedings? Like, I don't want you to see the kid at all. Why do they do that? And is there some things that parents can do? Is there a list of things you recommend parents do that will not hurt the kids during a divorce process?
So it's, I mean, one thing, it's so individualized in each situation. So usually, right, like I come up with different things for different people. But one thing that is consistent is to be able to say to kids, you don't like everything I do you?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You don't.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you love me.
Yeah.
So you can love somebody and not like everything they do and not like their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It can be the same with dad or with
Mm-hmm.
mom, right? Parents are people, they're not going to do everything well all the time. And don't confuse the behavior with the love.
Mm-hmm.
And it always makes me sad because there are some parents who really do try to turn the kids against the other parent, make it very
Yeah.
difficult for the kids to love the other parent.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me so sad because they're harming their children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like you said, you both created this human being or human beings. So they need both of you. Even if both of you don't want to be together anymore, you don't need
Well,
each other. But the kids need you,
well,
both of you.
and you know, like if your child says to you, "Are you friends with my dad?" Think about what the impact your response will have on the kids before you
Yeah.
say it,
Mm.
right? Like if you say no, a flat out no, that's not a healthy response for your child. And it's like, well, at this time we're not getting along the best
Mm-hmm.
right now, but yeah, I still consider dad to be my friend,
Mm-hmm. What does it take?
right?
Why is it that sometimes some divorces take forever? I was listening to some entertainment news the other day and they said, oh, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt divorced after 8 years of being in court. Finally, I'm like, these are rich people. Just settle the thing and get out of court. Why does it take so long for some of these things to get concluded?
Well, there's that's another thing about
Mm,
traditional divorce, because what happens is when you go to court, you forget about what's most important. So, for example, um, the first trial I ever did, it was in small claims trial, and I was representing a fellow who he had a manufactured home on a piece of land owned by somebody else in a trailer park, and he had made a deal to he would build a fence around
mm-hmm,
that lot, and the landowner would pay him back for the
mm-hmm,
materials. He would donate his labor. And he had told me the first time we met that his daughter and grandkids lived there and it was a busy street. But we go to court because the landlord refused to pay. And
mm-hmm.
when we went to trial, the landlord had a board from the fence brought as evidence. And I remember just, what am I going to do? Thinking, because this is my first trial. It's like, ah! So we were successful, except the court did not order my client get paid the taxes that he'd paid on the materials.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited, right? Because this is justice. This is justice. The court recognized the validity of my client's claim. This is great. My first trial, and we were successful,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm feeling really good until I talked to my client, who was furious. The judge didn't even listen to me. And it was all over those taxes. That's what he was talking about. And he wanted to appeal
Mm.
over less than $100. And
Wow.
and I'm like, what is going on here? I'm feeling like I'm in an alternate universe because my client was successful, and why can't he just be logical and go, okay, so he's getting most of it back. Why isn't he happy?
Mm-hmm.
And finally, after thinking about this a long time, the one time we spoke, I said to him when he was on this tirade, I said,
Mm-hmm.
why'd you build the fence?
Okay.
Right? And I said to him, didn't you build that? Well, the first time we met, you told me your daughter and grandkids lived there and it was a
Mm-hmm.
busy street. I
Mm-hmm.
said, didn't you build the fence to keep your grandkids safe?
Mm-hmm.
And he was silent. And then he was like, oh yeah. And then he was fine. There was
Yeah.
he was perfectly happy. What it taught me is that the legal dispute is not about what's important to the people is lost in court,
Mm-hmm.
completely lost.
Yeah.
So people who end up fighting in court, they're completely out of touch with what matters most.
Mm.
And of course, the brain, we have sunk cost bias. So once we end up on this one particular train or course of action, we stay on it. It's
Yeah.
really hard to get off it. And the other thing about legal issues is it doesn't matter how remote they are. A lawyer's job is to protect you against worst possible outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
right? So even, the people in mediation who have decided these are the items of property we're going to sell, but they don't decide everything. So they go to their lawyers and their lawyers are telling them, well, there's no agreement here because it's not
Mm-hmm.
written down. They have an agreement. People will do what they promise to do.
Yeah.
But the lawyers are undermining that because that's the lawyer's job. Because a
Mm-hmm.
lawyer is strictly legal issues. It's nothing to do
Mm-hmm.
with how people think.
Mm-hmm.
And the legal system isn't about justice or about making sure that your client gets a result that matches what's important to them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
fellow with the fence, it ended up when he remembered what was most important to him, what he had shared in the first meeting with me, and then we completely ignored because it was not a legal matter at all.
Mm-hmm.
But he got a result that matched what was important
Yeah.
to him.
Yeah.
And if you don't stop, and even like I prepared my own separation agreement, and it didn't mention custody,
Mm.
didn't mention who made decisions about the kids. Now, when I took it to a lawyer to get it signed off on, she wasn't going to let me sign it. She's, Kim, this is really bad, not
Mm.
mentioning custody. Like, you're not, when things go sideways, you're not going to be able to make a decision. Well, I knew from our personal situation that my gut was telling me if I do what she says, we're going to be fighting in court for a minimum of 5 years.
Wow.
And because I was part of the system, I was able to say to her,
Yeah.
look, can't you just prepare a letter that says I'm signing this against your best professional advice?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm-hmm.
if things go sideways, I can never sue you or the firm.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So she did that. And I remember when I signed that letter being completely furious, right? Because she made me feel like I was 8 years old. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
I do not know what's best
What
for
you're
my
doing.
family.
Yeah.
But I thought, this is me who's part of the system.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the risks. But for the average person who isn't part of the system, they're most likely who's feeling like a failure, feeling shame. They're going to go, well, what do I know? I know my
Mm-hmm.
instincts are saying no,
But the
but my
law
lawyer,
is saying so. Yeah.
so I better do what the expert tells me to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
you end up with this protracted, expensive court battle.
Hmm.
So part of what I do is helping people remember they're the CEOs of their families
Yeah. And of their lives. Mm-hmm.
and the legal issues. I mean, the law is never proactive, or very, very rarely is it proactive. Usually there has to be a problem, and then laws are made
Mm-hmm.
to deal
Mm-hmm.
with that problem.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it is with divorce, right?
Hmm.
It was real people, their marriages ending, that led to there being rules, legal
Yeah.
rules put in place and procedures, right? So I help people remember, oh yeah, this is, and to figure out the legal language, how it's really real life stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because once people feel the connection, they can be a much better advocate for themselves. Because, of course, a lawyer's job is not to make decisions for you. You make decisions. The lawyer tells you, well, this is what the law says. This is, these are the options. You decide.
So what I gather is we should really go to court with some common sense. Despite what the law says or what the lawyer is going to say, we should not throw common sense out the window. And that's how you're helping your clients to take the common sense into the court when they're going through divorce
Mhm.
proceedings.
Yeah, like, and it's like, I'm like, You know, sometimes I do mediation, sometimes I just do strategy work with one person
Mm-hmm.
beside the lawyer. So that the person can better understand the lawyer. And even I remember a long time ago, having a client who was sharing everything about, you know, her marriage. And I said to her, "Do you have an employee assistance program through your work?"
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Well, it would be much more cost effective for you to share this information with a therapist than with me because I have to charge you in 6-minute increments." And I
Mm-hmm.
love hearing it, but I know money's tight.
Yeah.
So it's and you know, it is just yeah, about empowering people.
Yeah.
So I always advocate, you know, not to hire a lawyer immediately.
Mm.
And I have like there's free resources on my website. I also have a group program for moms. Um, because it's when you go through it alone that it becomes really, really hard. And it's like the
Really hard.
scamming. It's like the
Mm-hmm.
scamming. Your
Mm-hmm.
emotions are
Mm-hmm.
in charge.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if
You
you
don't
have
think. Yeah. You don't
whereas
think.
if you have people who understand,
Mm-hmm.
that grounds you and you
Yeah.
can make better
That's
decisions. Yeah.
right. That's right. Let's talk about narcissistic partners. I saw one of your videos on YouTube, and you said that you really cannot define who a narcissistic partner is. But the people who go through relationships and marriages with narcissistic partners. So if somebody is in such a relationship and they're like, okay, why is this happening to me? They don't know how are we supposed to know the characteristics of somebody being narcissistic if you really cannot define it?
Well, I mean, it's a medical term, right?
Mm.
So, and I think it's part of the whole shame issue around divorce. Instead of going, you know, people change, we don't stay the same as we were when we met this person.
Mhm.
Um, so it's okay. You know, we change jobs.
Yeah.
We don't always keep the same friends forever, or the relationships change. Why can't we do the same
Mm.
with our partners, right? Like I'm saying, um, to take the shame out of it. So I think there's a real tendency to label the other person as bad so
Mhm.
that we then have a reason. It's like we're creating reasons, a stack of reasons to end it.
Mhm.
And it's so very, very painful. And the way our society is set up, it's far easier to blame the other
Mhm.
person sometimes than to
Mhm.
just go, oh, heck, we changed and this isn't healthy for our kids.
Mhm.
So what you see in unhealthy relationships that often get labeled as narcissistic is one spouse, like one spouse is staying quiet to keep the peace,
Mhm. Mhm.
and the other spouse doesn't have a lot of empathy.
Mhm.
There's not a lot. It has to be my way, my way, my way, my way, right? Like, and I mean, we all do it, whether we admit it or not, but we present our histories or what happens, it's from our perspectives. It
Mhm.
isn't this neutral, unbiased spot.
Mhm.
But you can end up with gaslighting, which is um, basically changing the truth.
Yeah. Tweaking it a
You
little
know,
bit.
like, for example, if it's physical abuse, gaslighting would be, well, I wouldn't have hit you if you weren't 5 minutes late.
Wow. One of my friends told me a story before when she was going through a unhealthy relationship, and she said that her husband was very narcissistic in the sense that she gave me an example. Said one time they have a common male friend who was going to
Mhm.
come visit them. And so the male friend calls the house to say he's coming. And the husband picked up the phone and he was like, okay, tell my wife. So he gave the phone to his wife, and the male friend tells the wife that I'll be coming over. So she prepares the food to welcome him. Okay. So when this male friend comes over, the husband just ignores him and goes upstairs and stays there the entire visit. The wife serves the man as they are sitting at the dining table eating. The husband takes a picture and sends to the wife's sibling and say, your sister is bringing her boyfriend to the house. Now, is that a typical narcissistic behavior?
It's a controlling behavior.
It's a controlling
Because
behavior.
because narcissism, it's based on a Greek myth of
Yeah.
this individual who thought he was beautiful and, didn't want a partner because nobody was
Mhm.
beautiful, right? Like very self-centered.
Yeah, it's me, 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 me.
And
And all that.
and it isn't, and the thing about like what we really need to watch out for is coercive control,
Mm-hmm.
because over 50% of women who are murdered, they're murdered in their homes, and
Mm-hmm.
it isn't by a stranger, it's by a male family member.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the controlling behavior, part of it is isolating them from their families. So,
Yeah.
like taking that picture and saying, look, she's got her boyfriend here, that speaks to coercive control, which means she could be in danger.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the thing with these controlling husbands, if they're narcissists, especially if they're narcissists in the traditional definition, they want to be liked. They want to be admired. So the people who say, oh, you need to go to a lawyer, that's the best protection, wrong. Because they're going to feel humiliated and they are going to strike out.
Mm-hmm.
And you are going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But if you can go to mediation with a well trained mediator
Mm-hmm.
who sees it for what it is, everybody can win,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like this is part of the narcissist wanting to be liked and wanting to be
Yeah.
admired. And so it's set up the system where they can be liked and admired,
Mm-hmm.
because you're going to get far better results. It's going to be done much sooner, spending way less money.
Mm. Sounds like they want their ego to be caressed and massaged.
Well, everybody wants to be liked, right? And it's this, you hurt me, so I'm going to tell the world. Wait till you're done. What it does is saying I'm married to a narcissist too, is it keeps you a victim.
Mm.
Do you want to be a victim for your entire life?
Mm.
Do you want to be stuck in trauma? It gets back to our discussion on scamming, right? It isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Mm.
We're all going to do some stupid things in life.
Mm-hmm.
We're all going to outgrow certain relationships. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay. We learn, if we can learn from them.
Yeah.
We don't have to let them twist us inside out and
Mm-hmm.
break us.
Mm-hmm. So do people who are in such controlling relationship know that they are in there, or they just
No,
think it's the norm for them?
they think it's the norm and they blame themselves. They think they're doing everything wrong. You can't see it, right? It's because your reality is based on where you are, your perception. So that's your norm. So a lot of the women I work with who are in really, really bizarre relationships, they don't see it, not initially, and they don't want to hear. And what I find interesting is a lot of the women, well, not a lot, but enough of them that I've noted, they're seeing therapists and they want help with divorce. But I'm the first person who ever says to them, do you feel safe? And talks about a plan. and mentions coercive control and say, do
Mhm.
some research on coercive control here.
Mhm.
And you really need to follow your instincts.
So what makes them stay? Is it the fear of harming the children? Is it the fear of saying that, oh, I'm divorced? When I was younger, I grew up in Cameroon. I remember one of my mother's friend came home and she had been battered by her husband. And she told my mom the story. I mean, I was right there listening. They didn't care that I was there. That he had
Mhm.
gone to a funeral wake and her husband was in their car and it was time for them to leave. So she was searching for him. When she found him in the car, he was with his girlfriend. And it was public knowledge that he had this girlfriend. And when she tried to like, okay, can you get us so we can go home? He just beat on her. So when she said this to my mother, there was nothing of like, I can't stay. But I did hear them say, what will happen to my children if I leave? Is it the fear of the children that we put ahead of our own safety that makes some women, stay in unhealthy marriages?
So that's a deep question,
Mm,
a really, really deep question, multifaceted. And we don't want to believe the horror of our lives sometimes, right? And it's become our normal.
mhm,
And when it's our normal, like the brain, what the brain tells us is what our normal is, it's safe.
mhm.
That's the message our brain
Yeah,
gives us.
yeah,
So it has nothing to do with the individual, but the way we approach it is we blame ourselves
yeah,
and the whole shame. And this institution of marriage, it started at a time when women were property.
yeah.
And so I did some research,
Mhm,
ancestral research, um, and I uncovered that my Scottish great great grandfather
mhm.
had reported his first wife to the authorities as a bigamist,
Okay.
and one of their kids was born in jail. So I researched the broader um, situation.
Mhm,
So his first wife, she was one of over 10 kids. Her dad was a minor. They were often in care. This
mhm,
is, in the 1860s. She couldn't read or write.
mhm.
Her first husband, they had two little boys. He was killed in the, I forget what it was called, but going up the mine shaft.
Mhm.
He got caught in the equipment, like a horrific,
Yeah.
horrific death. So she's left with two little kids, no way to support herself.
Mhm,
And she married this fellow. Um, he disappeared. And then she married my great great grandpa.
mhm.
And the court documents, because it's a very famous case, said that a woman came forward and told her that her second husband was alive,
Okay.
and that if she wouldn't, if Allison, which was the name of his first wife, if Allison wouldn't give this woman some whiskey, she would tell Allison's husband, my great great grandpa. And Allison's representative said she thought that her second husband was dead when she
Mhm.
married Thomas. And she was convicted of bigamy and, I forget how many months in jail. But I also researched what the conditions were like in jail at the time.
Yeah.
The men were in the cells, the women were in the center aisle. So she would have given birth
Right there.
right there. And So that whole story shows about women being in a lesser than position
Yeah.
and being dependent on men,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I could go on, like Thomas and my great great grandma came to Canada, and she ended up in an asylum for
Situation.
lunatics,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
Because he was ill. And this never came out till I discovered it 5 years ago. But he was ill. And the only way to support her kids was to have a reason for them to be adopted by other parents.
Mm.
And she knew where all her kids were, right? When she got out of the asylum, she ended up living with one of her children.
Mm.
So this a woman's dependence on a man for support is deep in our psyches.
Indeed.
And I'm not saying it's right, but I think there's a lot of that. And I think there's been a lot of abuse go on in homes that we've never talked about.
There is a lot. I mean, from my African perspective, when you mention bigamy, it makes me think of my African culture where polygamy is a thing, right? So you go to
Mhm.
the court. I mean, we see that today that some of the young people are revolting. So you go to the court and you say you want to get married. They always ask you, are you signing this marriage license on a polygamous or a monogamous basis? And there have been instances where the man says polygamy and the woman says monogamy and the marriage cannot go forward. But then you see the woman's people telling her, "You, where are you gonna go? Who's gonna marry you? Have this man for now. Before he gets a second wife, you would have had your own, space in the house and be the main wife." And so sometimes these are educated women,
I
women
know,
who
but
fend
it's
for themselves, but the
it's this
dependency,
it's deep
yeah,
psychological, and
it
it's women
is.
as property, right?
Mhm.
It's what it's still.
It still
And I
is.
mean, and you've talked about the African experience, and this was Scotland
Yeah,
150 years ago.
ago. Mm.
So it's actually, and people tend to roll their eyes when I say women as property and kids as property. The word custody
Yeah,
is a property law
yeah.
term.
You, I,
Hello, people.
wow. Yeah.
And it's what was interesting, even me, when I was thinking about ending my marriage, it was like, I don't think I can support myself.
Mm-hmm.
I was a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
But you had that fear.
I think what happens is when you're desperately unhappy in your home, it eats away at your self-esteem
It does.
and fear. And also when you're keeping quiet to keep the peace, you forget who you are and what's important to you. I think one of the things that was transformative for me was running into my former judo coach, and I hadn't practiced judo in 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me he wanted to start a judo club. And I said, "Oh, do you want some help?" And he said, "Well, Kim, just at the beginning, middle, and end of every practice." So I said, "Sure." But it awoke this sense of joy in me
Mm-hmm.
that was missing.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps the first step is actually finding something when you're in that haze of a relationship and it's your normal, but everything's kind of gray,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like to check out some things that you used to do that
Mm-hmm.
made you happy, because it might spark something that, oh, something is missing.
Yeah.
And my TEDx talk is actually, I think, has the potential to be a really good wake up call for moms and dads who really, really love their kids
Mm-hmm.
and don't realize what they're doing to them
Yeah.
by staying married.
Yeah. And so when one person stays quiet to keep the peace, the other person is more controlling. When they get in front of a mediator, what happens? How would you advise them to talk? Those who are really
Well,
quiet.
well, I would say they want to work with me
Of
because
course.
I have exercises that I've
Hmm.
created
Hmm.
that shift the dynamic, that
Yeah.
make it, because if you use the same approach that people
Hmm.
are used to, they're going to keep talking the same way,
Right.
communicating the same way.
Right.
They need a pattern interrupt.
Hmm. And you do mention that on your website. I saw that you talked about, 11 strategies for successfully negotiating with a narcissist. It's like,
Yeah.
wow. Wow. If you can just throw light on two of them, you said take control of the dialogue. If I've been so quiet in my marriage because the other person is so controlling, how do I take control now because I'm
Well,
negotiating?
but take control of the dialogue. Um, you communicate differently. In that, you know what you want,
Hmm.
but how can that benefit the other person? So you don't lead with, well, this is what I want. You lead with, I've been thinking, and I know this is really important to you, right? And with your background, like you don't lead with, well, I've done this, and I want this,
Hmm.
right? It's just having a good conversation, but from the other person's perspective and knowing.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's like the legal system, for example, the there's always, with interim applications in court, there's always written evidence. And there's a tendency, one person does the affidavit and the other person just responds, well, I agree with this. I don't agree with this. I would always actually have that, but I would write out the story from the other person's perspective,
Mm, beautiful.
right? So that it isn't just, you're not just letting the other person set the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they're not going to hear you if you start with, this is important to me. That doesn't matter to them.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
oh, how would this benefit you?
Yeah. And then do not respond immediately. Silence is your friend. I like that one because I mean, in my personal life, when I'm angry, I don't talk. My son always tells me that, Mom, don't talk because I can't even understand you. Don't talk. So I have learned to not just say anything when I'm really angry and give it a moment and then come back
Mhm.
and face the topic. So don't
Mhm.
you
Look
say
at
don't respond. Silence is your friend. How long should I stay silent if I'm in front of a negotiator or a mediator?
well, till you're ready to talk.
You're ready to talk.
It's okay to say, I need some time with this,
Hmm.
right? And that's something that I'll discuss with my clients is how long does it usually take you? So that the other person knows as well. Okay. And then we discuss too, well, who's going to bring this topic
Hmm.
to the table again?
Right.
Because ultimately, if you have kids, you need to be able to have some of these discussions
Right.
yourselves without outside assistance.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're teaching your kids much more. Like there's always going to be disagreements.
Yep.
That's part of life.
Hmm.
But to be able to demonstrate to your kids to do it with respect is such a great life lesson.
Yeah, that's true. Finally, I want to talk to you about an interview I watched on your YouTube channel. You interviewed your husband,
Yeah,
Jeff,
my second husband, yeah.
your second husband, Jeff, about being in a controlling relationship. And he had a lot to say about it, but you kept prompting him to say more. Um, I think what I gathered from that is if you've been in such a controlling relationship, it's hard for you to put that same control on other people. you remain a humble, submissive person. So how has this experience from such a previous relationship of being controlled help you in your relationship with him now be more peaceful?
Now that is a question nobody has ever asked me before. And I mean, and part of my like there's a lot of research out there about women being in controlling relationships
This was a
and
man.
and
Yeah.
and very little support for men.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that so that women could or so that men could actually know, oh, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
It's I'm not going crazy, like how I'm feeling. So that was the impetus behind that interview. And I'm thinking, I've never even thought about your question
Mm-hmm.
about how, well, I know early on, before I even knew anything about coercive control or one of the things I was doing in my to reclaim me after divorce is I actually went back to school and got my master's in law. Kids and I moved and we ended up having an opportunity to move into a family residence. And I was dating Jeff by then.
Mm-hmm.
And I should say, I did not start dating Jeff as soon as I left.
Mm-hmm.
No, no, I never advocate that. This was a couple of years later that I met Jeff. And my dogs, I had two greyhounds. And of course, pets were not accepted. And I had to figure out what to do with my dogs. And I knew Jeff's last relationship had been very traumatic, and he'd been left with the cats,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, and I didn't want to set up that same dynamic. So even though I was a student, I paid him every month to look after to keep my dogs because I wanted a different, right? So instinctively, like I didn't recognize that pattern at all.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew I just can't ask him to look after because it's going to bring up stuff for him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So is it very common or is it more common to see women than men in controlling relationships? So when I listen to your interview, I'm like, wait, it's a man's perspective. Okay. Most often it's a woman who says he's controlling. I can't do that. I
Uh-huh.
can't do that. I was like, men also face this. So bring it to the public.
Yeah.
So you see
Well,
more women than men, I guess.
and it's interesting. There's some of the traditional, like a good mediator will do a screen for domestic violence and control
Mm-hmm.
with the clients. And I find it interesting. The traditional questionnaires, it's binary. It's as if one person is abused and the other person is a perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
But when I use those questionnaires, each consider abused and has examples of when the abuse has happened. I don't know if if it's more women than men. I don't think there's been any research. Certainly, there's a lot more research on the women. I know with the men, it happens. Jeff is not an isolated incident. And I also know how I check for it more than the questionnaire. And I worked, I had a job once adjudicating landlord and tenant disputes. I did
Mm-hmm.
that for a few years, on and off. That was, so being like a judge. So having to evaluate evidence.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting in a controlling relationship is one person is very, very charming,
Mm-hmm.
very articulate. Oh, they're great to talk to.
Yeah.
And the other person They're very indecisive. They want to know a minutia of details before they can even consider making a decision. They can be whiny. Um, like they're hard to deal with. But the interesting thing is that person, the degree of facts that they share is really detailed. Whereas the person who's very articulate and charming doesn't have the same level of factual support.
Mm-hmm.
So I always know then, oh, this is interesting. This is a controlling relationship
Mm-hmm.
based on how they present
Yeah.
separately.
Yeah.
And and often the abuser, if it's a woman, does say that the man is abusive. And then I talk to the man and think, no, right? Like the articulate person will say, this person is abusive.
Mm-hmm.
The person who's abused doesn't usually use that language. But
Wow.
everything that I hear in the demeanor is this person's abused.
Wow. You really just have a strategy to figure these things out. So, can you please tell the audience where to find you if they need to talk with you? What does it take to get a hold of you?
So gentlewaydivorce.com. Um, and I offer a complimentary 20 to 30-minute consult. There's also in the blog, there's good resources there. I recently just did one on the top 5 tools for peaceful divorce with
Mm-hmm.
links to some of the other resources I've prepared.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's the best way. And it's Kim Korven on Facebook and Instagram and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
LinkedIn.
think you're doing great. One of your videos I enjoyed watching was you said keep your eyes on the prize, don't be too distracted when you are on that path. And I think that is what most people really forget to do. Like you just said, I learned from you today is like get in there with a common sense. Don't just get in there and think that it's going to be me, do that, do that. And let's not use our children as
Well,
bait.
and the legal system is not there to protect you.
Yeah.
Like it is, but it isn't. It's not going to save you, I should say,
Mm.
right? And I think, we're so uncomfortable. We don't want to face this person. So it seems the easiest course is hiring a lawyer.
Oh, yeah.
And a lawyer has a really important place, but
Mm-hmm.
you need to get grounded first.
Yeah.
It's like um, going before surgery is done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Usually there are certain tests that are done to ascertain what exactly needs to happen. Going to a lawyer immediately is you're going for surgery without the test being done. And keep your eye on the prize. That's really about knowing what do you want your life to be like in a year? And another good question for people to ask themselves, it's part of that process. And when I was a lawyer still representing people in court, I used to say, do you want to pay me or do you want to have money for your kids?
Mm.
So do you want to pay your lawyer or have money for your kids? If it's one or
Mm-hmm.
the other, because there are some things like you don't have to win all the time. There are
Yeah.
some things, and it's accepting what's most important to me and what can I let go of.
Yeah. Wow. This has been a wonderful and very educative conversation. Kim, I want to thank you so much for making the time to talk with me on Talk to Me Africa today. Thank you so much. Thank you. One last thing before you go. Did I give an assignment to bring a wise word or word of wisdom to
No.
share? I did not. I always give
Well,
my,
well, but I can, but
I
I
did.
can
It's
do
right
that.
here. I said, please bring
Okay.
a proverb or wise word to share with the audience.
Well, I mean, it's to keep your eye on the prize, but also be curious, not furious.
Be curious, not furious. Awesome. Well, stay warm in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan. How do you say it?
Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan. Yeah.
Well, I mean, houses built, they're all insulated. They're plain glass. We have furnaces that heat our homes.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So you're warm
you know,
enough. Yeah. Thank you so
it's
much.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And have a wonderful new year.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.